Try the link again.
Mm-hmm.
It's a public live stream.
And when did you put it to start?
No, it's already online. Everyone can watch this now.
Oh yeah, it says chat. Why does it say? Ah, because I'm through your account. Okay. Through. It's going to. Inactiva. It says that it's not active. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now it will be.
Okay. Get the link of this.
Okay. Okay, now we are online. Okay. You do it through your computer or mine?
No, through mine.
Through yours. Okay.
Not possible anything differently.
Okay. Check if this is working now. What's in the app?
Yeah, but please keep it. I need to see the window there. If the YouTube, I need to see if this works.
Yes. Okay, I think we still have to change it.
Where is it?
Okay.
This is the link.
Okay. Okay. It's working. And the notes are here. Okay, so sorry for the technical issues and the problems. Yeah, this was the first time using the platform, and yeah, the event got rescheduled, so we were struggling a bit to make it work. But hopefully everything works. We are in contact with Javier through the app, so hopefully you can enjoy this presentation. We are going to be most of the time, both of us here. We got now a little dog, a puppy, and there might be some emergencies, and maybe one of us has to keep for some minutes with the conference. But anyways, we are very, very happy to be here, and also to this wonderful initiative. And thanks to Classic Spark for making it possible, and to Javier and Maria and everyone behind. So I think we just start with it, and you should be able to see some slides on your screen. There might be a bit of problems that we see, that they are a bit cut, but hopefully you get the.
Well, most of it will be visible, hopefully. And the next trouble will be if the sound works, and especially the sound examples that we're going to play, but we'll see while we go along. Maybe we check the chat from time to time to see if everything
Yes.
is good.
Yeah, I'll do that.
So, well, this is supposed to be a very general introduction into a huge topic, performance practice, especially what is usually called historic performance practice, and in connection with a specialty of us that we worked on since many years, and that is the study and analysis of early recordings, so recordings from the late 19th and early 20th century. And we'll just show you a few examples to get you an idea of how these things are related to each other, in our opinion. So, historically informed performing practice of so-called early music has become a large and well-established segment of the classical music industry, while HIP, as it is abbreviated, sometimes has the reputation of working with fixed sets of rules and being rather dogmatic. It is, on the contrary, a very diverse field, and it is therefore hard to define common goals or methods of HIP in general. However, everyone who engages in playing classical music in a supposedly historically informed way probably comes across a few general problems and questions, some of which we would like to discuss briefly now. So the historical distance of one or several centuries to the music that we play naturally changes the way we approach and understand music in comparison to the people at the time of its creation. Our cultural, educational, and aesthetic background has probably very little in common with neither 17th century Italian church musicians or 19th century French opera stars, for example. This is true for probably any form of art, as we will certainly also not understand a Rembrandt painting or a novel by Victor Hugo in the same way as their contemporaries did. However, looking at a painting or reading a novel is a silent form of appreciation and understanding. It involves only the spectator or the reader. In music, as a performing art, however, we as performers are forced to make active choices based on our reading and understanding of the music. Only in the way we perform the music can other people then appreciate it through listening. So our job resembles, therefore, in many ways that of a translator. Although this is by far not a mandatory goal for musical performances, many musicians seem to share the idea that it is part of our job to convey to our audience some idea of what the composer meant. The impossibility of determining the composer's intention has, of course, been part of a lengthy debate, mainly through the second half of the 20th century. And while it is clear that we will never really know what the composer wanted, a certain sense of moral obligation almost towards the composers and their works has never really vanished, and maybe shouldn't. And if we slightly rephrase the question and tone it down a bit, we might really come up with meaningful answers to questions as: what did he or she mean by the signs he used in the scores? How could he have expected others to read them? What sound did she or he expect from the instruments in use? Which playing technique could be expected by the musicians at that time? Now, which of those questions can be answered and to what extent depends largely on the types and amount of available sources. These sources and what they can convey to us change over time, and for some composers or eras or regions, they might be very scarce. Also, just as a musical score, also written sources or iconographical sources bear the risk of misinterpretation due to the historical distance. A watershed moment for documenting and researching the history of musical performance was, of course, the invention of sound recordings at the end of the 19th century, with the Edison phonograph and shortly after the gramophone. In many ways, despite their technical deficiencies, even the earliest sound recordings tell us more about how the music was really played then than all the text sources we have from previous centuries. So that's why we would like to start with a short example from a very, very famous early sound recording by the Italian singer Adelina Patti, who had already reached quite a high age when she made recordings in the early 20th century, but she was certainly one of the most established opera singers of the 19th century. And some of you might know this recording, of course, as it is very famous. Yeah, maybe we need to check if anyone was able to hear anything at all from this. But if they did, then, and if you didn't know this before, then many things were probably quite confusing. We will look into fewer details later, but analyzing specific aspects about this recording would, of course, only tell us something about the performance practice of this time, this repertoire, this performer, etc. However, as a first impression, it seems the most important to simply realize how different this performance is from what we would do today, although based more or less, at least, on the same musical text score as we would use it today. So it becomes evident that for discussing performing practice and its changes, the relation between the score and its different editions and the performance is crucial. So let us first take a look at what musical notation can tell us about the maybe intended performance. Sorry, wrong orders of the slides. This is an autograph of a piano piece by German late Romantic composer Max Reger. And with the exception of maybe advanced graphical notations for contemporary music and experimental notation, this is pretty much how classical music is being notated until today. Reger's score is illuminating because he used a particular color scheme to differentiate the pure music, so to say, the notes in black, from a secondary notational level in red, which deals with all matters of performance and interpretation, so dynamics, articulation, tempo changes, etc. This is basically the limit of how far you can go with specifying in conventional notation how a piece is supposed to be performed. This particular notation of Rega can even be called over-defined, as it sometimes is practically impossible to literally follow all his instructions. However, when we listen to Rega's own recordings, and fortunately quite a couple of them survived on Velte Mignon piano roll recordings, it becomes evident that this is still only a fraction of all the subtle performance nuances he implies with his music, which would have been impossible for him to indicate in the score. It is especially striking that many aspects of his performances do not only affect the red layer of performance markings, but also the black layer of notes, especially in terms of rhythmic alterations. Considering that even Rega's notation cannot convey even remotely complete picture of the envisioned performance, and that for the most time in music history, musical notation was much less dense than Rega's, and often contained very little to no performance indications, we can safely assume that following a score to the letter, even if the score itself is a critical addition and philologically spoken, historically correct, it will result in a performance that is far from being historically informed and in many ways will simply be wrong. This was, I think, a major fallacy of the so-called Urtext movement, especially in the middle of the 20th century. Opposing, certainly with some good reasons, against an overly individual and highly subjective performance style, a purified performance style, based solely on what the composer had written, became fashionable, especially in the 1950s. While we do very much rely as performers on well-researched critical editions as the basis for our performance choices, it is nonetheless imperative that we acknowledge that much of what was considered tasteful and beautiful performance is not directly indicated in most scores.
Yes, so I will continue with the presentation, maybe just small comment for those who are maybe more in the beginning with performance practice would be that, for example, if we look at this score by Rega, we see that there are these what we call in English hairpins, which are in red, and which were actually not signs as we tend to think today for crescendo or decrescendo, but also implied agogic fluctuations. And we have evidence of this, for example, of the Clara Schumann student Fanny Davies, when she writes about Brahms. She mentions exactly this, that this is also a matter of lingering with the tempo. Two terms coined in the 19th centuries are essential for understanding performance practice problems. The musicologist Hugo Riemann used the phrase verloren gegangene Selbstverständlichkeiten, so in English, things that were taken for granted but are forgotten now, to describe aspects of their musical performance which were so deeply integrated in everyone's daily experiences that they were rarely discussed in theoretical works. These things were maybe discussed in lessons, but more often they were probably simply learned by imitation without any conscious reflection. It was simply what everyone did. And unfortunately, that doesn't mean that they were insignificant. They were simply so obvious that to everyone that no deemed it. They were so obvious to everyone that no one deemed it necessary to talk or write about them. Though we have some small hints about this, not only in the early recordings, but also smaller hints maybe in the written sources, but one has to find them a bit like a detective. Musicians such as Clara Schumann or Joseph Joachim, who were more in the, we could say, in the conservative movement in the 19th century, so they didn't expect major alterations to the text, meaning, for example, changing many of the notes, nonetheless spoke about a necessary quality of artistic performances, which they refer to as reading between the lines. It meant a deep stylistic and artistic insight into the music, which can only be taught to a certain extent and ultimately depends also on taste and ingenuity of the performer's side. Nonetheless, it is striking to observe that performers from the same tradition or school seem to have been reading between the lines in a very similar way, as we discover through early recordings and piano rolls. In between these two extremes lies the large field of Vortragslehre, which comprises of all aspects of musical performance and expression that was explicitly taught in treatises. Faced with the vastness of descriptions and publications, why might think that this is all that we need to know? Actually, early recordings make us completely aware of the fact that even with the most detailed descriptions, words can never make us fully understand the finer nuances of musical expression in earlier times. Because what does it mean for us to imperceptibly slow down, and what did it mean to a 19th century musician? What does it mean to slightly prolong a dotted rhythm or a dotted note, etc., etc.? For example, Carl Czerny speaks about not changing the tempo of in one movement if it's not specified, and that these changes should be imperceptible. But of course, for us nowadays, that we were trained very much using the metronome and being told not to change the tempos, we have a very different perception of normality than what they had.
One of my favorite examples to show the limitations of musical notation and the performance practice problems resulting from it is a piece by the French Baroque composer harpsichordist Louis Couperin. Especially in comparison with a piece composed by Johann Jakob Froberger, another 17th century harpsichordist. Froberger and Couperin knew each other well, they were even friends, and so they were, as they knew each other personally, certainly aware of their respective performance styles. However, they came from very different traditions. Froberger was trained in Italy and with Frescobaldi, and also notated his music very much in the Italian style, whereas Couperin, of course, used typical French notation. And for free music like toccatas and preludes, there was a significant difference. At that time in Italy, it was fashionable to write everything in a metrically strict way, almost, we could say, again, overdefined, whereas the French preferred these improvisational music to be written down in what they called a prélude non mesuré, a non-mesuré notation, so white notation without note values and without bar lines and time signatures. Interestingly, there is an example in which Couperin quotes music from his friend Froberger, but transcribes it into his own non-mesuré notation. So it is a toccata. It is definitely in the stilus fantasticus expected to be played very freely, and not in a rhythmically strict sense as Froberger's notation might imply, on at least superficially to us. And we see here these two pieces next to each other, and if we look at it in modern notation, we can see that it is indeed, at least for the first section, the identical music, but written in a completely different way. First of all, the plain chord in the beginning is dissolved into a wild arpeggio, which was certainly expected, and then the rhythmically accurate Froberger notation of the first scale is also written in this free, unmeasured way, even adding a trill. So performance practice is to kind of explore the space between these two extremes of notation in finding a way of playing this. And of course, in the 17th century, this is still very much guesswork for us, as we have no recordings. But these two extremes of notations kind of give us a guideline for boundaries. So I think this is very fascinating. It becomes obvious from this example that conventional notation has enormous limitations, especially in conveying rhythmic subtleties, which, however, were quite essential to music at probably any time. A deliberately imprecise notation, as the French non-mesuré notation, is sometimes maybe more likely to convey the intended performance result than a strict but limited metrical notation, which always bears the risk of being taken too literal. Oops, this should not have started. Do they work, these audio examples?
Yes.
Okay. Fortunately, we have a unique source that predates any music recording, but still is able to provide us with some rhythmic information far more detailed than what notation or verbal descriptions could achieve. For a treatise on how to make barrel organs, so automatic small organs, as they were used, for example, in clocks or so, the French engineer Marie-Dominique Joseph Engramel collaborated with one of the best organists of his time, Claude Balbâtre, in the attempt to transfer as many details of Balbâtre's playing style onto a cylinder for a barrel organ. He was meticulously aware of minute rhythmic details that would distinguish an artistic performance from a purely mechanical transfer of the score as it is written. From written sources we know that the effect of French Baroque music depended largely on rhythmic subtleties, especially the note inégale, and the versatile rhythmic placing and execution of ornaments. In their famous treatises, harpsichordist François Couperin, the son of Louis, and flutist Johann Joachim Quantz, who worked in Potsdam and Berlin at the court of Frederick the Great, and what was trained in the French style, mention this and explain the concept. So here is Quantz. Wherever possible, the principal notes must be brought out more than the passing notes. In accordance with this rule, the quickest notes in every piece of moderate tempo or in the adagio, though they seem to have the same value, must be played a little unequally, so that the struck notes of each group, namely the first, third, fifth, and seventh notes, are held somewhat longer than the passing notes, which are the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth, although this lengthening must not be as much as it would be if these notes were dotted. This is a fairly precise description, but only together with Engramel's instructions for the barrel organ, which can, from his very technical notation that we see here, easily be transferred to a computer-generated MIDI file and then into sound, we can have a clear idea of how it might have sounded, because only here the basic phenomenon of the note inégale is embedded in the context of other small rhythmic alterations, like the placement of the ornaments, that the left and the right hand are not always played together, etc., etc. So let us just listen to a few seconds of this barrel organ as transcribed by Engramel. Okay. Oh, sorry. The next. I just realized there is a slide missing. I'm very sorry.
You mean with the Klinger quartet?
No, with the Schumann.
Okay.
But anyway, I think we can skip this as we have quite some other examples as well. These rhythmic inequalities turn up in different contexts, not just in this very specific context of the French note inégale. We have similar things, for example, with slurred pairs of notes, as for example already Leopold Mozart describes this, and there are very nice examples, as for example from the Klingler Quartet in the early 20th century, where we can still hear what Leopold Mozart describes with the lengthening of the first note under the slur, and that this creates a similar effect even if it's no longer in the context of French Baroque music. And I think this is the important point, that that even beyond this specific example, rhythmic alterations on the level of small metrical units and note groupings remained an important feature of artistic expression way into the 20th century, as all of these early recordings tell us. Yeah. Maybe you want to continue?
Yes. Even more in contradiction with the urtext mentality are, of course, any alterations of the notes themselves, be it through ornamentation, improvisation, or arrangement. Early recordings of composers such as Scriabin, Debussy, or Rega show that they didn't follow their own course piously as we demand it of ourselves today. This raises the question of whether the composers even gave any significance to the idea of a Fastung letzter Hand, a definite final version, or if the performances shouldn't just be regarded as another, yet equally authentic and authorized version of the piece. In the case of Debussy, some of his performance variants in his piano rolls have found their way into the newest critical edition, and at least in one case the recording proves convincingly that a very important tempo indication was missing in the first and all successive editions, without anyone else noticing or even Debussy commenting on this information that was missing. Ornamentation and improvisation were undoubtedly part of the everyday musical life, at least until the middle or the end of the 19th century, although, of course, tastes and attitudes towards it change from generation to generation. Only in the 19th century, people started to forget that even up to Mozart, the Italian bel canto operas, and even early Verdi, composers deliberately left blank spaces in their notation to be filled with improvisations and ornamentations. And maybe this praxis came even later, from what we can see on singers on early recordings. It would have been regarded as patronizing by the soloist if the composer deprived them of their freedom for virtuosistic display. It was just part of the show and of the musical expression, of course. Colleagues heavily criticized Bach for not respecting Johann Sebastian, these boundaries between the spheres of the composer and the performer by writing out all the ornamentations in his music. The only instances in which ornamentations were written are those cases in which the performers did not have sufficient knowledge in rules of composition to make them themselves, as it becomes obvious in Mozart's piano music. When a piece was performed by himself, he left many blank spaces to be filled spontaneously, so he didn't overload the sonata or the concerto with ornamentations. But when, however, a student was supposed to play it, or when he prepared a piece for a final publication. Many times he would write everything meticulously, which doesn't mean necessarily that he wouldn't expect maybe some smaller changes.
Last evidence for this practice can be found on early recordings, especially of opera singers in Italian repertoire, but also with pianists. So, for example, Theodor Lischetizky, arguably the second most influential piano teacher of the 19th century after Liszt and a student of Karl Czerny, largely extends the ornamentation in a nocturne of Chopin, probably not unlike what Chopin himself was doing in performances. And we will now listen to a short excerpt from this Lischetizky recording, which is a piano roll recording from 1906, in this nice YouTube video where someone has gladly aligned it with the score. And we'll jump in the middle of the piece where the initial motif from the beginning is repeated, so kind of the recapitulation, and we see how Lischetizky starts augmenting the ornamentation there. It's in the lowest line now. So we see that he extends the range of the ornaments and fills in additional notes. It's subtle, but it's consistent through the piece that he takes these liberties, and this is very similar to what we know from especially sources from Chopin's students, that Chopin was himself doing and encouraging and even giving to his students alternate ornamentations for some of these pieces. So this is certainly something that is not against the intention of Chopin, as we hear similar things also in recordings of students of Liszt, sometimes even heavily rearranging some of his pieces like the Hungarian Rhapsodies or so, which was all authorized by Liszt explicitly. And we have such variants from Liszt's own hand in just the same fashion as what his students did. Karl Reinecke, who was the oldest musician to have made any recordings, even wrote a treatise on how to fill the blank spaces in Mozart's music, which we could easily consider one of the first HIP treatises, as his methodology, already with almost 100 years of distance to Mozart, is not so different from what people like Robert Levin or so are doing today. Amazingly, we even have two separate recordings of him playing the slow movement of Mozart's Coronation Concerto, the Larghetto, proving not only that he does what he writes about in his book, but also that he altered his ornamentations from performance to performance, which is also an important rule, not only in 19th century, but especially already in earlier music, that you never say the same thing twice in the same way, but you ornament when something repeats instead of repeating it literally. Here is the picture of the catalog from the Hupfeld company, which is one of the companies that Reinecke recorded for. The other one is the more famous Welte Mignon. And one of his two editions he made of this piece, where he suggests some of these alterations and ornamentations. And you can find both the Hupfeld and the Welte Mignon recording easily on YouTube. So and compare them for yourselves. It's very interesting to see. Australian pianist and researcher Neil Perez da Costa, who is very well known for his book Off the Record, in which he analyzed many early recordings, has demonstrated that Reineke's approach to Mozart still has a lot in common, in fact, with what we know about Mozart's own playing and that of his students. In a recently published recording, he merges elements of Reineke's style, especially his freedom in tempo and frequent arpeggiation, with ornamentations transmitted by one of Mozart's students, Barbara Pleuer, in his performance of the Concerto K488, the A major, the large A major. But in this case, not on romantic instruments or even early modern instruments, as Reineke used it for his recordings, but on period instruments from Mozart's time with a period instrument orchestra. And this combination, in my opinion, works splendidly, and I would encourage you to go to the website of that project as well and listen a bit.
Yeah. So it was also, for example, customary to improvise preludes and interludes between pieces performed in concert. Clara Schumann wrote down, as her daughter asked insistently to do, some of her preludes for the music of her husband, and very few pianists still preluded and modulated between pieces in recorded live performances in the early 20th century, though we can still find recordings as late as maybe Dino Lipatti doing these small preludes. A particularly nice example was even captured in the recording studio of the Ampicor Reproducing Piano Company. Ukrainian pianist Tina Lerna begins her recording of Brahms's Waltz in A-flat major with a lovely prelude.
And we can listen to this briefly. This is a very fascinating roll because it is a very late Ampicor roll, and it's a very long one. It's what they called a long playing roll, in which they apparently made pianists perform several pieces in a row and publish them on one roll. This roll lasts about 15 minutes with 5 or 6 different pieces. And since it was really recorded obviously in one take, she felt the need to modulate between these 5 or 6 pieces that she is playing, and in between all of them there is a little interlude or a prelude for the next one that leads into this the key, and here is what she does, coming from a Chopin prelude, I think the F major Chopin prelude, and continuing then with the Brahms waltz. And so on.
Yes, so an even more controversial topic are tempo fluctuations, over falsely generalized under the term tempo rubato. While there is no doubt that already in previous centuries some styles and genres like Stilus Fantasticus, Freie Fantasie, Recitative allowed or even asked for enormous freedom in tempo, it is for many people irritating to see how widely the tempo fluctuates in practically all early recordings, though in different degrees. Even to see how widely, even chamber music and orchestral performances rarely keep a completely steady pulse, and performers and conductors shape structure and phrasing of the pieces largely through tempo modifications. With modern technology, these tempo modifications can be measured and described much more precisely than what theoreticians could convey through words in the 19th century. In many cases, they reveal architectural structures in tempo, as in the following example by Elgar. So, when conducting the famous Nimrod variation of his Enigma variations, Elgar manages to create a perfectly symmetrical accelerando and retardando over a 30-second long phrase.
We can listen to this, and I would even it will start where the red line is, and the graph just shows the tempo. So the higher these little bars are, the red ones relate to the quarter notes in the score, and the blue one to the whole bars. The larger they are, the more time he takes for these bars or quarters. You can follow this, but I would also encourage you now, while listening, that you try to conduct it with your hand to get also a physical experience of how this tempo modification works.
Such large-scale tempo modifications were controversial even within the 19th century, and a significant point of debate between the new German school of Wagner and Liszt, for those whose performance style was crucial, and the more conservative musicians in the tradition of Mendelssohn and Reinecke. And while early recordings indeed confirm differences in the extent of tempo modifications between different schools, like the students of Liszt and Clara Schumann, or Scriabin also as a very extreme example of tempo modification. It is even more telling that even conservative performers who actually cautioned against an excessive use of tempo modifications used it much more than anything that is permissible today. It seems, therefore, likely that even in the 18th and 17th century, when tempi were supposedly handled stricter than in the 19th century, this did by no means imply a metronomic performance, but on the contrary, most likely would have appeared rather free to our modern ears. An almost Wagnerian instruction for tempo modifications can be already found in Türk's piano school.
This is not Türk. I don't have the Türk here on the slide, but what Türk says in a very interesting moment in his piano school is that sections that are marked with piano or pianissimo dynamics should simply be played slower. This is a very basic rule, and of course not very sophisticated if you take it literally, but it has a bit in common with what Wagner 60, 70 years later proposes, that motifs that have a more calm or character shall be reduced in tempo considerably. Though to a lesser extent, this change in tempo with changing dynamics was, as we have seen already, anyway implied with many dynamic modifications like the hairpins and so. So it is a matter of degree, but it's not that the 18th century was completely alien to these ideas and unfamiliar with them. And we would never claim that it was done in the same way as what we hear in early recordings, though, and this leads us to the next slide and the next example, it might not be that far. Excuse me. Because in Czerny's pianoforte school, so middle of the 19th century, when Czerny was already quite old, he published this enormous piano treatise, and he gives a description of how even a very modest and simple musical thought, in this case something he composed himself in this andantino nocturne style, how even this can only be delivered artistically with almost ubiquitous tempo inflections in almost every bar. And in a way, what he describes here, and he gives, beyond the general rules for when to apply ritardando and accelerando, he gives, with this list of numbers here on the left side, basically instructions for every bar on how to modify the tempo. Like, for example, if we look in bar number 2 of this musical example, his description is: the 3 last quavers of the second bar must be retarded a very little, indeed almost imperceptibly, there we have it, imperceptibly so, as the next or third bar is a repetition of the first bar and therefore of the principal subject, though on other degrees of the scale. So we see he goes through all of these bars and has basically to say something about tempo modifications in the vast majority of them. You see that the first bar must be played in strict time, and then there is bar 13, that would be number 11, which he wants in time, but and a couple of others. But in most bars something happens, according to Czerny, if you want to play this with taste. And there is a nocturne by John Field, so that is not so far from Czerny's style. It is even way earlier than Czerny's piano school, but musically not so distant from Czerny. And this Field nocturne shares a lot in character with Czerny's example, and also, by coincidence, the key is also in A major. And Karl Reinecke again recorded this Field nocturne in 1906 or 7 for the Hupfeld Piano Company, and we can listen to the beginning of this. And if we would make a very close, detailed analysis, we would see that it is not that he always does exactly what Czerny says for analog places, and you could make a lot of analogies here musically between these two pieces, but that it's rather this idea of that something happens that is very present in both of Czerny's description and Reinecke's recordings. So sometimes Reinecke speeds up in moments where Czerny would suggest to slow down, but it is clear that there is a connection between something structural in the music and the tempo inflection, whether it means speeding up or slowing down.
These are just a few examples to explain why we believe that listening to early recordings is important, also for finding a historically informed approach to earlier music. While we by no means want to claim that classical or Baroque music was performed in exactly the same way as we hear on the earliest recordings. We do believe that the deliberate, radical, and relatively sharp break of performance traditions that occurred in the 20th century, especially with World War II, has a different quality that the permanent smaller changes in taste and style that naturally occurs and distinguished every musical era and generation from each other. Many of the forgotten performing traditions still observable in early recordings most likely have been around in one way or another for centuries, and understanding them in early recordings can also help us to adequately understand region sources from times where no recordings were possible.
And we thought we would close with a short example of ourselves performing a small selection of Brahms's waltzes for piano four hands. One of them we have already listened to in this Tina Lerner Ampico role, because this is an example of how we also work practically with recordings to come to performance practice results for our own playing. This is not a direct imitation, so not a real reenactment of one particular recording, but it is rather something that we developed comparing several recordings of these waltzes from the early 20th century, some of them by, for example, friends or students of Clara Schumann.
Students, also with sorry, we have a bit of a problem with the battery. So there was a bit of an emergency also with the talk. When we compare these examples of students by Clara Schumann and also of students of or people that were either in contact with Brahms or who were famous
Oh, yeah, we do.
No? Okay.
Can they still hear us?
Yes, I will check if this is still working. Oh, yes, we are still online.
Not sure.
Yes. No.
Not
Not
sure
sure if it's finished.
still
Willkommen to live chat. Yeah, I think we are still online. Yeah, we'll check again. Looks a bit frozen, but I think.
I think the stream collapsed.
Okay, I'm checking.
Yeah, I have to. Okay, I think the stream should be back now.
Okay, hopefully we're back online. It is working. Okay, yeah, it says that it's working.
Okay.
Okay, so yes,
sorry, I missed what you said.
Yes, we were saying that that we created a video in which we try to inspire our performances by other early recordings, not in a way of strictly copying what they're doing, but rather to imagine in the first case with the solo piece how they played. In this case, I took as example for my performance a student of Clara Schumann that recorded the Davidsbündler Tänze, but she did not record all of them. And then for the Brahms part. We took as examples recordings of musicians around Vienna or musicians belonging to this conservative style, but also others that were just famous for their Brahms interpretations and so on.
So I think the webcam has collapsed for some reason. That doesn't work anymore. But at least the PowerPoint still seems to be online. Okay, so yeah, and this is a method of working with early recordings, taking them as a source in the same way as for earlier centuries we take written sources to base our recordings upon and to our performances upon and to be inspired by and to try to learn a musical language, a musical style, and in a way early recordings can teach us this in an even deeper way, because they contain, as we had said, all of these forgotten things that were self-evident to the people, all the unreflected things that they were just doing because they always did it that way. They show us very particular choices that apply only to a particular piece, and so working with these recordings can be really rewarding also for developing new practical approaches to performance and to music. And we just play a few minutes of these, the results of this experimentation.
See.
Okay, so that's it. This is the end of the conference.
Sorry.
I hope that you enjoyed, despite the slight delay and the technical difficulties. We are there in the on the web page in the chat. So if there is any question that you want to ask, of course we will happily reply. Yeah, and we want to thank you again. I will refresh this to check also on YouTube directly. I don't see many questions for now. Okay. Yeah, I don't think that there are questions. Well, we are there on social media and so on. So in case you have any requests or so, just don't hesitate contacting us. And yeah, it was a pleasure to be here on this app, and hope to keep collaborating with you guys. And yeah, thank you very much.
And
Thank you.
enjoy the evening. Have a good night.
Yeah, good night. Bye.